on the other side of the screen, all around in the world, so okay, thanks. Can you close the door, please? Okay. So I'm very glad to introduce you our keynote for today in the evening, David Baines, please. David began working at SEAL International in Philippines in 2000 and later worked for SEAL in Chad. Yeah? And he joined the language software development department of SEAL International in 2007 as a software tester for Fieldworks. And many of his roles, like all of us at SEAL, have included liaisons between linguists and developers. So you are the right person to be here, really like the bridge between linguists and developers. So it's very important to such kind of experience. So let's start.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming, and thank you to the organizers. I'd like to extend a very sincere thank you to them for inviting me to share with you a bit about SIL's data collection. I've been preparing this talk for quite a while, several months now, and it's been really nice to have that time and feel quite well prepared. That's an unusual feeling. But it's quite a broad topic, and I really would like to find what you're interested in and passionate about, and what we're interested and passionate about, where the intersection of those things lie. So I hope to invite questions at various points through the talk, not just at the end, so that I can respond to questions as we go. So here's a bit of an outline of the talk I have prepared. I'm going to look at the history of data collection from SIL. Then we'll look at the data that is in the collection. Look at how you can access the data, where that's possible, and discuss some possible uses of the data. Yesterday I was speaking with Michael, the originator of Lexonomy, well known to us here, and he has kicked me off with the first question, which is, what is SIL and why does it seem so mysterious? So let me try and answer that question to begin with. SIL was started by William Cameron Townsend. Now, there's an excellent Wikipedia article that gives you a bit of his life's history and explains the origin of SIL. He went to first Guatemala and then to Mexico in order to sell Spanish Bibles, and discovered that they were not much use because the people didn't speak Spanish. So in 1934, he founded the Summer Institute of Linguistics as a summer school to train linguists in order to translate the Bible into the Cachiquel language. I think it was Cachiquel, I may have got that wrong. And since that time, SIL has expanded, and SIL linguists have worked around the world documenting and analyzing data for hundreds of different languages. Now, over the last 85 years, of course, the world has changed dramatically. Back then, long-distance travel was by boat, not plane. There were no laptops. There were no phones, or certainly no mobile phones or smartphones. And there was no internet. So SIL has always worked with the local people and had to adapt to that local situation and to the culture. And we've had a history of adapting technology to and also creating technology as it's been needed. So before the advent of laptops, we just used notebooks and pencils. But they're not ideal for creating dictionary data, because if you write your dictionary in a book, how do you sort the words into alphabetical order? And what do you do when you need to add one in the middle? It's tricky. So we started using shoeboxes. and I have one here. This is quite a modern version of a shoebox. And the linguist would store their words on 3x5 cards. Oh, that's a blank lot, but these little 3x5 cards. And that gave them some advantages over a simple notebook. Because you can sort the data, you can add them, you can throw them away, you can use a rubber to make corrections. This box I have had for a few years, but it wasn't until I was preparing for this talk that I did a little investigation about its history, and there are some clues on the front here. It says Des Derbyshire, box 12, which isn't a great lot to go on, but I looked up Des Derbyshire, and I found a really fascinating history. At least I thought it was fascinating. He began working with the Hish-Cariana in northwestern Brazil. I believe this is him on the right of the picture. He spent a total of 7 years, over 16 years, from 1959, working with the local people there. And during his study of Hish-Cariana, he discovered that the word order was object, verb, subject. During one of his first classes for his PhD studies, he was under the Professor Geoffrey Pullum, who had just made a careful study of the claims of object-initial languages and discovered that none of them stood up to close scrutiny. So he felt quite confident making the statement, no object-initial languages exist. And Des hesitantly raised his hand and said, "Sir, I speak such a language." It took him a couple of weeks to convince Geoffrey Pullum that it was correct, but the data and his claim the data was quite solid. Going back to this particular shoebox, I was surprised to see the date on the front, which says March 2008. Isn't that a bit scary? It's like, ooh. But I noticed that this is one of the later models. It has a much higher storage capacity than most. And this has been achieved by replacing most of the 3x5 cards by thin pieces of paper. So you can get many more words in it than usual. And as usual with technological advancements, there's a bit of a trade-off. So in this case, the higher storage capacity has been achieved at the cost of durability and ease of use. Just a little aside, some linguists introduced a further technological advancement, which was a system of slots and holes in their cards. You can't really do that with paper, but then they could mark all the verbs and have a hole where the verbs was, not a slot, and slide a knitting needle through to bring up all the verbs in one go. But they had to be careful not to bring them all the way out, otherwise they have a lot of work resorting them afterwards. So there we go, that's a little story of Des Derbyshire and shoeboxes. Another major advancement in technology, of course, were computers. And one of the first portable computers ever made, 1976, I'm kind of astounded, was made specifically for language data collection. This is a photo of it here. Dr. Joseph Grimes was a linguistics professor at Cornell University, and Gary Simons on the left here was his student. And Gary was studying both linguistics and computer science. And they agreed that a computer would be needed for Gary's fieldwork. So it was built by Bill Hemsath, who was an engineer in the psychology department, on the right in this picture. And the computer he built had this green screen with 5 lines of 32 characters each. It had 16 kilobytes of memory. At a substantial cost, it was thousands of dollars. And a tape recorder which operated at 300 bits a second. And Gary and Linda, his wife, used this computer for language survey work in the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea in 1976 and 7. So then SIL began developing programs for computers, and one of the early ones was really based on this idea of a physical shoebox, and it was just a digital representation of that. It was a DOS program. There was no GUI to begin with. Just like the shoebox, it imposed no structure whatsoever on the data. That was entirely up to the linguist to decide. They eventually developed MDF, which was a recommended standard of codes, but it was widely ignored or adapted, so it didn't end up being all that standard. So the linguists could set it up any way they like, and typically it might be like this with your lexeme and part of speech and codes for each of these. They could set up a completely separate project in Shoebox or Toolbox for doing text interlinearization. But in this case, there was no communication between the two, so there's no link between the words in the interlinear text and the lexicon. Gary Simons was also behind LinguaLinks, which was our first program, which structured linguistic data and lexicographic data with a database. That was LinguaLinks, which also included a library of texts that were helpful to linguists. And, well, for me anyway, it confused me because I didn't know what it was. Is it a library? Is it a program? Oops. But it was on its way out when I joined SIL. Fieldworks was released in 2006. And this program is also based on a database structure, and we created a very detailed model of language with hundreds of different fields for different parts of, the academic data that a linguist may create or discover as they investigate a new language. So we have areas for storing phonetics and phonology and orthography and synonyms and antonyms and relations and even discourse analysis. This is a standard sort of screen for a lexical entry with the list of words and affixes and lexemes in the middle, and on the right-hand side, details about one of them that's selected. Fieldworks was developed from the outset with the idea of keeping the data and the presentation separate. So the user can create several views of the data for different audiences. And this would be an example maybe of, this is the same data shown again. In a publication view, you've got it's for an academic audience. Maybe it has all the affixes in there, parts of speech. Some have example sentences and glosses or definitions. This is another view with just the same data. Maybe for a child's dictionary, it's essentially just a list of words and glosses. Now, because the structure is fixed, the linguists can't make up their own tools so easily in Fieldworks, so we have a tool for doing interlinearization. This is linked to the dictionary, to the lexical entries, and there are a couple of parsers built in, so if you've put all of the right slots in place, it's quite complicated setting it up, but once it's set up, it can be a very great assistance to doing interlinearization. More recently, we incorporated a collaboration feature, so you can send your data to a central server called Language Depot, typically, and then other people can grab that data who are part of your Language Depot team, and they can work on the same data, and you do a send-receive. It's not like Google Docs, which is automatically real-time collaboration. It's asynchronous collaboration. And finally, this data model we have created for Fieldworks, we've extracted more recently from Fieldworks and made it as a separate component so that several different programs can use it. And Language Forge, which we'll look at next, is one of those. So Language Forge is a web app. It's rather simpler than Fieldworks, but it uses the same underlying database. So not all of the fields that are available in Fieldworks can be accessed or edited in Language Forge. But because it's using the same underlying database, it can link to Language Depot, and you can have different people in your team working on two programs accessing and modifying the same data. Lastly, this last little bit of history, Dictionary App Builder takes XHTML exported from Fieldworks and turns it into a dictionary app for your Android phone or your iOS phone. You need a Mac and Xcode in order to make iOS apps. So if you're using Windows or Linux, you can only make Android apps. So there we go. That's a quick overview of 85 years of both software development and a bit of language data collection from SIL. And I would just like to invite questions at this time before we move on to the data that we've collected.
Motivation was to translate the Bible, okay? That was a very, very long time ago. And what is the motivation today? I mean, is your motivation still to translate the Bible into as many languages as possible? Is that your personal motivation? Or
yes is the short answer, I would say, yeah. But I would say it's also not the only motivation. So I think personally, I see language documentation as being valuable. I see the social impact or the change in a society that can happen, that can come through language development and through Bible translation. So yes, I think yes is the basic answer. Yeah, and actually that comes through when we start looking at the data. Probably the data that we have that is in the best shape is the Bible translations. But now it gets a bit complicated because SIL doesn't publish Bibles, but we do hold the copyright often, but not always. But great question. Any others?
Any others? It seems that not here. Okay.
Nothing to do with religion. I've known Gary Simons for years, but from, I would say, another side of him, because he's been involved in the text encoding initiative and has been seminal in defining, for instance, the feature structure module there, and has been investing a lot of his time in collaborating with the text encoding initiative community, I would say. And on the other side, a lot of SIL tools and frameworks were not related to this. Can you explain the reason in the background? Was it because you had some legacy software? And what would be the vision for SIL to somehow concertate with such initiative and international standardization?
Yeah.
I mean, you've also been very active in relation to language codes and the like, so you've been already going in these directions.
Yeah, another great question. And actually, I think you've sort of answered it. I think legacy systems is a large part of the answer. You know, things have moved on organically the way they have. Gary is extremely innovative, which is probably why he's involved with the TEI and the text encoding initiative, and the rest of SIL is 20 years behind, perhaps. Behind Gary, yeah. Well, behind the rest of the world as well, perhaps. So I would love to see a way we could export fieldworks data, which is XML. It's valid XML. How do we translate that into TEI? But we just don't have the people to do it. So if anybody can help with that, that would be exciting work, and it would open up our data to many more people, I think. So, yeah, it's something I'm quite passionate about.
So this is a matter of resources?
Yes, I would say so. Yes, it's a matter of resources. Like Fieldworks, for example, we had a problem with language tagging in Fieldworks because every piece of data is tagged with the language and script and the usual stuff. Well, usual in Fieldworks. And so, but not all of our programs were using the same system for tagging languages, even though they were based on the same Fieldworks model. And so we had to do a lot of work, well, just one person, to standardize that across our products, but primarily in Fieldworks. And that took him months this year, and we released version 9 this year to fix that problem. But now we have nobody working on Fieldworks, and it's just a lack of resources. So, yeah. Yeah. Two more questions, and we'll move on.
So following up on just what you said, we have a project where we are exporting our Flex database into XML and have programming to align it with TEI. So this is the teacher project. It's a corpus of colonial Zapotec language texts. And we're doing exactly that, where we export the Flex and align it with TEI for being displayed online. So I can send you that. And we have our code is all open source and on GitHub for people to reuse or reapply.
Yeah, excellent, superb. Thank you so much. I'll come and chat to you later. Yeah, thank you.
Could you say a bit about the user base for these tools that you've presented? Who your users are and how many?
For Fieldworks, it's a bit of a guess. I think we have around 900 users for Fieldworks. But I don't have accurate data. It's Language Forge at the moment is used very lightly. It's not there are features lacking, and it's not really been developed yet for being a presentation format in itself, but that's something that we would aim at. So you could do your dictionary development in Language Forge and then just present it on the web in Language Forge as well, but it's not really set up that way presently. Dictionary app builders, I think there are probably hundreds of apps that have been built, but it's difficult to install because it has a lot of dependencies. Well, so you don't need to be a programmer, but programmers will find it easier than your average user to install it and get everything set up and running. So we actually have a service where people can send their data and they'll create the app for them. And then, which is sort of perhaps crucial, they'll keep it up to date as Android and iOS, increment their versions. So otherwise, somebody said, you write a book, you get royalties for life. That's wonderful. You write an app, you've got work for life and no pay. So we're trying to avoid that problem. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Thanks. Okay, we'll just move on and have a little look at the data. So there are 4 sources of data I'm going to discuss. And I'm looking at the sources because the source determines how you can access the data and largely determines what's in it as well. So the first one is the ethnologue, which has language identification data and country profile information. The second is the Digital Bible Library. That is not an SIL. It's not SIL, it's another organization. But we submit our Bible translations or New Testament translations to the Digital Bible Library. And from the Digital Bible Library, you can get them on YouVersion, the app on your iPad or tablet or phone. Webinary we'll look at briefly. That's a dictionary publishing platform that we have. We've included a sort of one-click upload from Fieldworks into Webinary, so it's very easy to keep your data up to date. And then REAP is our repository. It's an archive. It was developed initially as an internal bibliography a long time ago. I forget the year exactly. We have 45,000. Oh, we'll get onto that. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Anyway, that's a wee overview of where I'm going with the data. Ideally, everything we do that's published ends up in the archive. That's not reality, but that's the ideal. So I'm going to look at the ethnologue now. The ISO 639-3 standard is managed by SIL and gives every language a 3-letter code. Ethnologue.com has a summary information about all of those. We'll just go and have a quick look. If I want to know about this coming up, yeah. The languages spoken in Portugal, for example, this is a good place to look. And we'll have a look at countries. And this might be surprising. The number of individual languages listed for Portugal is 10. And so here's the list of languages spoken in Portugal. So another thank you I have to make is for Zepeto, who picked me up from the airport. And we went out for a nice meal. And he told me about Mirandese, because it's a language he speaks. And he says, oh, the ethnologue's out of date. It says that there are 15,000 speakers who speak Mirandese, and that can't be right. There's only about 3 to 5, so I have to get something updated. But he says it's political, as is so often the case with these things. So, and then there was a really nice story he told me. His father is not a believer, he was agnostic, but his father translated the New Testament into Mirandese. So I looked that up, and I can find the Mirandese New Testament on my iPad, which I just did this afternoon. So I still have to verify with him that it was father who did that, but I imagine there's only one translation. There are 7,101 living languages listed at present. See if I can go back to this. How do I do that now? And if you have data about the number of speakers in a language and the geographical extent where it's spoken and things like that, then please do contribute that to the editors of the ethnologue. So the Digital Bible Library, as I mentioned, contains translations of the Bible from many different agencies, not just SIL or but whoever's doing Bible translation. The Bible, as I say again, is the Old and New Testament. In English, it's about 728,000 words in the whole Bible, so not all that long. Most of our focus has been on the New Testament, which is half as long as the Old Testament, so that chops the number of words down considerably. Sorry, I'm getting, oh yes, there is more. I thought I was a bit short. We could consider these translations as an aligned parallel corpora. because they're aligned at the verse level, which is roughly sentence level. And aligned parallel corpora are quite rare. The EU has 24 official languages, and they have a fairly large parallel corpus with 26 languages. But as we'll see, we have digital versions of translations for 828, mostly New Testaments, only a few Bibles. Most have between 100,000 to 400,000 words in them, so that's a very small corpus. I mean, you lot might not even consider it a corpus. It's like, that's a book or something. Well, that's what it is. But it is in a digital format, so it's easily machine readable. There's a little look at the translations done around the world. This is roughly, the colors roughly represent the numbers. There's only a couple I'll point out. Mexico is where the work started. And so there are a lot there. There are 287 languages spoken in Mexico, and 124 have a New Testament translation or a Bible. Papua New Guinea has 840 living languages. It's the country in the world with the most languages because of its geography, which is very mountainous, and pretty much every valley has a different language. We have 219 translations of the New Testament that were done in Papua New Guinea. Now, this data is for Bible translations worldwide by all agencies and including historic data, so it's not all digital now. A total of 2,600 languages have some translation. It's at least a book of the Bible. Now, a book might be quite short, just a couple of pages, the shortest books. We have New Testaments in 1,500 languages and Bibles in around 700 languages. There we go. So I'd like to invite questions now about those two. I'll just go back to Ethnologue and Digital Bible Library before I move on to Webinary and REAP.
So please, you're welcome.
Yeah, I know.
I was just wondering, do you have Chinese?
Yes, the Bible's been translated into Chinese for a long time. Yes. Yeah. And you can get it on your phone if you wish, or your... I'll come on to that when we do access. So how to get this data and how to find it, that's coming up, yeah.
So it seems that we have to go to access, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to access, so I'll just go through Webinary and REAP. Yeah. So Webinary is a publishing service we have for dictionaries. There's 181 dictionaries of different languages up on Webinary. A lot of them are quite small. There are 150 with at least 1,000 entries. The largest has 46,000 entries, and they're at various stages of completion. We'll have a quick look at Webinary. I can search country here. Let's have a little look at Papua New Guinea and select a dictionary. And go, and this just takes me to another site with the dictionary. So there we go. This one's quite small. 2,964 entries in English, 3,300 in Soskundi, and 2,000 in Tokpisin. And a little view of what the data might look like. This data and the way it looks just depends on the way the user has configured it in Fieldworks, and this just sucks it straight in, so it's quite configurable. They can reconfigure it and just press upload. It wipes out everything that they previously put on Webinary and replaces it with what's ever currently in Fieldworks. So it's not terribly smart in that way, and there's no versioning or anything like that. Oh, this problem again. Archive, REAP, is published on the web, on our sil.org website. If you go to resources and look for the archive, you'll find it there. I'll come back to it when I look at access and show you different ways of searching through it. It has 45,000 public citations, and about 19,000 of them have something you can download directly from the site. If you find a citation and there's nothing there to download, you can request it from the contact form, and we'll get in touch and tell you how much it will cost. Which might be free. We might just say, oh, yeah, we meant to scan that and put it up, and then we'll just do it, and there it is for you. But there may be a charge. And now I'm jumping ahead to access. So it's easy sometimes. Which, of course, means sometimes it's quite difficult. I'm going to go through the same things in order again to look at how you can access the data. First, the list of languages on the ethnologue. On the site, you can just download the code tables directly and import them into your application or use them for whatever you wish. They're just CSV files or tabulated data. That's just the basic data. Ethnologue.com has a lot more data, including country profiles, listing all of the things, some maps. They're premium maps, which are more detailed, and it's available for a subscription that starts at $5 a month. Translations. Sometimes it's difficult. Well, and this is because often there are multiple agencies involved in the production of a Bible translation, and there may be multiple copyright holders. I think, I'm not too clear on the legalities of it. Even if we hold the copyright outright, we have a duty and a responsibility to the community where we did the work, and so we're quite sensitive about that because we want to maintain good relationships with the people we're working with. Sometimes the copyright is held by a national organization such as SIL Papua New Guinea or SIL Nigeria or wherever the work was done, and not held by SIL International. So access depends on who owns the copyright and how they're willing to license it. However, even for Bible translations, sometimes it's very easy. It just depends on what use you want to put it to. If all you want to do is read the Bible, that's our whole motivation, as we were saying earlier. So we make that as easy as possible. You could just download it on your phone for free in pretty much any language we have a digital version for. So if you go to the YouVersion app, you can get it there. It can be quite hard to search YouVersion to get the right code to get the Bible you're after if it isn't something simple like English. But if you go to scriptureearth.org and put in the country code or the language code or search there, you can find it. Now, for more programmatic access, you can go to scriptureapi.bible. And this is a service provided by the American Bible Society. You can get an API key for free, and then you can suck in some Bibles and put them into your app that way. Of course, you have to abide by the various terms and conditions. I can't really comment on those. Moving on to dictionaries now. There are some on Webinary. They're not all that easily machine readable because they're in XHTML. Some of them let you download a printed version that may have been formatted as a book, and it's a PDF file. The archives actually have about 1,100 different things that are listed as dictionaries, lexicons, or vocabularies, so there's rather more there, and I'll just have a quick look at that now. and also show you some ways of searching, all being well. So I need the culture and language archives here. If you just come to siart.org, you can click on resources. Sorry, this is and then language and culture archives. It's possible to browse by these different terms, contributor or author domains, which are like academic domains, subjects, language codes, countries, the journal series, or the subject language. I'd like to just show you the search button. If you search with nothing in the field there, we get these filters. So we can search for a content language. Somewhere in here, I think there's Hishkariana. But this view here only shows the top 50. So in this case, I can't find it there because it doesn't appear in the languages with the most results. So I'll have to search for it by language code, if I got the language code correct. So here we find some items from Desmond, Derbyshire, and I can view the publication, and I think this is possibly the one that we saw earlier. Oh, and there's even a link to Amazon.com where theoretically you can go and buy it. Whether that would work or not, it's maybe. There we go. So that's access to the data, rather briefly demonstrated. So I'll stop here and ask for questions before looking at some uses.
Yeah, please. Do you have any questions? You have actually 5 minutes left for your talk. Maybe you just can talk about users, and then we can proceed to questions. You have only 5 minutes left.
Oh, 5 minutes left.
Yes, so maybe just
sure.
talk about users, and then we can...
Uses.
Yes.
Uses are, good. So the obvious use for some of this data is if you're studying an individual language that's not very well known to you, and you find some information about it in the archive, and you get a grammar description or a word list or something like that. That's obviously a very simple use. Something that I find really exciting is the prospect of using the digital translations of the Bible as a parallel aligned corpora for AI. And in September 2016, Google they switched their Google Translate to a neural network using AI. They developed a new technique for translating where they appended a language code tag to the start of every sentence in order to indicate the language of that sentence. And they didn't need to make other alterations to their system. They just indicated to the AI, here's a tag, that changes the sense of this sentence because it's now a different language. They scaled that system to 103 different languages. And so that's what they support now, I believe, on Google Translate. And one of the advantages of this system was that they didn't need explicit language pairs. So if they had an aligned translation for English to Korean in the past, that's what they needed in order to do translation between those two languages. If they had another set which was English to Japanese, then they could do English to Japanese. But with this system, they could add those two, and now they could do Korean to Japanese via the intermediary of English. And it worked reasonably well, as well as the previous system anyway. And they called this zero-shot translation. In other words, machine translation, without ever seeing that language pair in the past. When they scaled this up to 103 languages, they discovered something quite interesting, which is that the machine translation seemed to be generating an interlingua, a representation of meaning that was independent of any given language. That it sounds a bit strange to me, but it's a really interesting theoretical idea. Now, this is where I have lots of questions and get quite excited, but, I don't have the skills to do anything with all these questions, unfortunately. But what are the limits of this improvement? What would happen if instead of 100, major languages we just had 100 languages, but all from the same language family? How would that change, the translation quality? Would it improve it? I also wonder what would happen if we said, here's the Bible in 700 languages, and here's the New Testament in one language. Now give me a draft translation of the Old Testament. Actually, someone has done this experiment with quite successful results. But yeah, that would be a very interesting thing. And the third question would be, what can we learn from this interlingua, this representation of language that's independent of any one language that the AI seems to create? Anyway, that's enough questions from me. I wonder if there are any from you.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So please, sir. Yes.
You mentioned a couple of applications of the existing resources, in particular in the context of machine learning. A specific question goes for the dictionaries. What are the reuse conditions to take the existing dictionaries there and integrate them with other lexical resources? Because there are quite a few ways to extract information automatically now, even from the HTML or PDF. So,
that's a great question, and the data Webinary is a service provided by SIL to anybody who wants to use it. So not all of the data on Webinary belongs to us. On the other hand, of course, it's mostly used by SIL people, and so in that case, we would ultimately own the copyright to that work. Some of them, I believe, are Creative Commons licensed, and that's the license that we recommend people use if they're using Webinary. So some of them you can just download and use directly because the license is already there.
but it's not systematic.
It's not systematic, no. It depends. It's per dictionary. Yeah. And actually, this was a question I had for the head of the dictionary lexicography services that we had, which was essentially, what data do we have that's ready to give away? And the answer was, we don't know. So they've set up a working team to look into that. And this, just as I said at the beginning, or some partway through, was the data we have that's in best shape is the Bible, because that's something where, I'll leave it there. Sorry. On the other hand, one other thing to say about that, the archives have 1,100 dictionaries. Many of those would be PDF format, but there may be some data sets. I forgot to mention, in 2018, the archive had about 500,000 hits and 250,000 downloads, and 8 of the top 9 downloads were dictionaries from that site. Many of them Mexican for some reason, but there we are. partly because Mexico branch is one of the best branches at uploading data for us. So, yeah. Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes,
Miklos.
One, and I can start
Yes.
myself with the mic. So I wanted to go back to the access. It's something that keeps repeating. Also, I remember from when I talked to you before. So, and I very well understand all the reasons and all the troubles, because SIL is a very sort of heterogeneous organization with sort of a very dynamic, flexible, and localized structure. But are there any attempts to synchronize or harmonize the access conditions, copyright, unify things, and so on? Because sooner or later the copyright will get void, right? Within 70 years, 8 years, depending on local law. And apparently, some of the texts are already, or some of the translations are already at the edge of that, right? I mean, SIL started very early, so it would be actually beneficial for SIL to be able to make the most out of what you currently have within the time frame that is kind of given, right? So are there any attempts to sort of unify that, synchronize that, make it clear what's available, under what conditions, and so on? Or is that still sort of,
Yes, it's something that I've discussed with my supervisor. I think it would be very nice if we could, for example, have an academic license or something like that for scripture that would make the scripture data available for academic use. The Digital Bible Library operates a bit like a library, and as an organization, you could apply to become a card holder of the Digital Bible Library, and then you can negotiate your access to various translations, and they will automatically manage all of that. So there is already a system in place. It's outside of SIL, but it gives you potentially access to all of the translations that have been done, not just to SILs. And it gives, all of them are then digital and in a nice state. You're not having to deal with PDFs, it's all XML, and it's all in a very well documented form. So I think that would be at today, that's the best answer, is contact the Digital Bible Library and apply to become a card holder. But we are looking at other potential options. Some of it comes down to resources, and one of the phrases I keep hearing is equitable value exchange, by which they mean we want to sell you something so that we can afford to carry on doing what we do. At least that's one equitable value exchange. If we're giving you something that cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce, which it probably did, what do we get in return? And not because we want to be greedy, just because we want to carry on doing what we're doing. I would put it that way myself anyway.
Okay.
And that's largely because funding for the organization has changed fairly dramatically in the last, say, 5 years. It's dropped off since the financial crisis of 2008 and various other things. So it's stabilizing now, but it's still a struggle.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks.
So I'm afraid we have to stop here. And,
Thank you.